are listening to Pre-Market Prep. I'm Brianna Valesky here with Joel Elkann, and we have Adam Feuerstein on the line. He's a senior columnist at TheStreet and has been for more than a decade. Adam, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Oh, it's good to be here on a Friday morning. Thanks.
Absolutely. Great that it's Friday, too. I was looking over your... Exactly. I was looking over your morning note this morning. We were just talking about Bluebird Bio earlier on the show. Your note mentions Bluebird's sickle cell data. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Bluebird Bio has been one of the, really one of the better stories in biotech over the last year or so. It's a gene therapy, and for many years, sort of gene therapy was kind of was sort of a backwater for drug development, stemming from some safety issues that popped up with gene therapy, years ago. But the technology has evolved and the science has evolved, and people have sort of figured stuff out. And so Bluebird is really kind of at the forefront of a bunch of companies that are looking at gene therapy for a host of diseases. And what's really interesting about gene therapy is that it's potentially curative, right? So oftentimes we talk about drugs that will treat the symptoms of a disease, but don't cure a disease. But what's really exciting about gene therapy and Bluebird is that you have the potential to actually cure a disease. So their initial approach is looking at a couple of different inherited blood disorders. And so what I wrote about today was sickle cell anemia, sickle cell disease. And they're going to have an update and some important data. Sometime this year. They haven't really said when this year. A lot of people kind of are speculating that the data will come in June. But we're going to see an indication of whether or not their gene therapy is effective in sickle cell coming up. And what we're looking for is, they've had the reason that people are so excited about Bluebird is that they've had some really impressive data in another inherited blood disorder called beta thalassemia. We saw some of that data last December that looked, really strong. So, people are kind of getting very excited about this next slug of data coming up in sickle cell.
Adam, we've got a question coming out of our chat room here. They're asking for your odds on, I'm not sure the stock specifically, it's ticker CLDN. They've got phase 2 data coming out. Do you have any?
Right.
Yeah, what's your take on that?
So Celadon, so ticker CLDN. That's it's Celadon, and that is also another gene therapy company. Now they're sort of instead of blood disorders like with Bluebird, they're focused on cardiac disease, so heart failure, cardiac stuff. So they've got an important phase 2 study that is going to be reading out fairly soon. Now, I've written about them. Probably a little bit more difficult to kind of assess whether or not this is going to work or not. Whereas, I think people are a little bit more confident with Bluebird. But in sort of the same vein, where it's very much a sort of a pivotal event that's coming up for Celadon. I think the data, off the top of my head, I think the data are coming out. I think they're expecting it before the end of the month. So it's coming up relatively soon. I did write about it recently, so I'm actually trying to call up my story as I talk to you to remind myself.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks for that. We're probably going to get a couple more questions coming from the chat as we move around. Another thing that stuck out to me from your note this morning was about Gilead Pharmaceuticals. You were referencing a story in Boston, in the Boston Business Journal, where the author was saying that there are 5 potential takeover targets, but you don't think that's really the case. Can you go a little further into that for our listeners?
Yeah, Gilead has been a company that's like I wrote today. It's there's always been kind of takeout rumors. The company is under there's an activist shareholder that's kind of been agitating for change at the company. My beef with the sort of this most recent speculation about takeovers. So I just think that the list of potential suitors, he had there was like Amgen and Celgene and Gilead Sciences and Pfizer, Roche. I just don't think any of those companies are going to be interested in acquiring Gilead. I don't think it sort of fits. It doesn't really fit their strategy in terms of their business development strategy or their M&A strategy. Now, that doesn't mean to say that Gilead couldn't be taken over at some point by somebody else. I mean, look, you can't say definitively that would never happen. I just don't think that those companies would be the suitors. And I think that Ariadne's valuation at this point where it sits is problematic. It's not a cheap stock.
Right, absolutely. That's a great point. One thing that we're noticing this morning is Bristol-Myers. They announced a Checkmate 057 trial stopped early, and we're noticing that it seems to be trading up in the pre-market. Any thoughts on why the stock might be responding
that actually
positively?
is kind of funny. I mean, that literally that news hit the wires like 30 seconds before we got on this. We started this interview.
Yeah.
So cancer immunotherapy has been a huge topic. Tons of investor interest. Bristol-Myers Squibb has a cancer immunotherapy called Opdivo. It's approved in melanoma. It's approved in a certain form of lung cancer. They just came out with, literally like 2 minutes ago, they just came out with new data for, again, another lung cancer trial that was stopped early for efficacy. That's stopped early because the drug is working, and so they're stopping the trial because it's got overwhelming efficacy. So, again, that's just more good news for Bristol-Myers, and again, it will just fuel this investor interest in all the cancer immunotherapy stocks.
Okay, so they're stopping the trial early because it's working so well.
Right, that's good news, right? Sometimes trials get stopped early because drugs don't work. In this case, it's stopped early because the drug works really well.
Wow,
so this is good news.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. We have another question coming out of the chat. One of our listeners wants to know about your thoughts on BCRX. I believe that's BioCryst. He's wondering if he feels like TheStreet is kind of negative on the name. What are your thoughts on the fundamentals for BioCryst?
It's not a company that I follow all that closely. They are developing. I think their lead drug now is they have a. I think part of the problem is that their lead drug is there's a lot of competition for in the space and where they're developing their lead drug. And so I think that just sort of overhangs. That's an overhang. Not to say that their drug is not effective or not. I just think it's sort of in the early stages, and it's not really clear how it separates itself from the competition, both drugs that are approved and other competitive drugs that are in clinical trials. And that's something that investors sort of have to look at. Just generally speaking, if you sort of wonder like, hey, why isn't my favorite stock responding well? Remember, you always have to sort of look at things more broadly and look at the competition and look at where other companies that are developing similar drugs and similar indications are, because that can often explain why a stock underperforms.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. On Twitter, there was a great response you had to an article that Benzinga had on its website off of an interview with the CEO of Cytori. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the stock.
I'm generally a skeptic of most sort of stem cell therapy companies.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very difficult area of drug development. It has not shown much promise. Just today, another company in the stem cell world, Athersys, ticker is ATHX, is blowing up because they had a study in stroke that failed today. So the stock is down sharply this morning. So that's my beef mainly, is that I feel like these companies don't really have very much going on. Cytori being among those. So it's not my favorite area.
Totally understandable. So what do you think are some of the stronger names in the biotech sector right now?
I think all of the we mentioned sort of the big caps, just in terms of I mentioned them, and we would mention them in respect to sort of whether they would or wouldn't want to buy Ariad. We're talking about the Celgene, Gilead, Biogen, Amgen. I think I think all those stocks are doing well. There's been a lot of talk about are we in a biotech bubble? That's been a big debate, and I think you can't really look at all biotech stocks the same, right? There are certain, because the stocks are not homogeneous. So there are certain companies that are doing really well, where you would look at the valuation and say, yeah, it's perfectly reasonable. And I think for a lot of the big cap names, I think that you can make that case that these are companies that have strong revenue growth, strong earnings, they're growing, they've got deep pipelines. so that their valuations are more reasonable. Then, when you get down to some of the sort of smaller cap names and the much more speculative stocks, that's where you kind of start seeing a lot of the sort of the bubbly sort of stuff going on. So that's kind of where I think people should be raising alarm bells. In terms of companies that I really like, Bluebird is one that I've written about, and I think that they're doing some really amazing things and interesting science, and it's playing out in clinical data that they're generating. So that's one that I really like. I think Receptos, ticker is RCPT. It's another one that I think is really interesting. Intercept Pharmaceuticals, another stock. ICPT is another one that I like. In cancer immunotherapy, I think I would, especially kind of coming up into the June timeframe when we get into the big cancer meetings, look at Celldex, CLDX. I think that's another one that's going to have some interesting news in sort of the May-June time period.
We have a couple more questions coming out of the chat here. People are very interested in getting your take on some of these stocks. NVIV, I believe it's in vivo, rings its bell on the NASDAQ this morning.
Right.
Long and short-term outlook on that?
I don't know anything about it.
Okay.
I mean, I do know about it, but not enough to sort of say anything.
No problem.
It's a really small cap, like penny stock, I think. I think they just uplisted to the NASDAQ. So, yeah.
Okay. No problem at
opinion.
all. And what about Mankind? Another one someone's asking about. Seems like Alfreza sales.
Mankind is it's kind of a retail cult stock.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of attention. They have an inhaled insulin called Afrezza. I'm sort of well known as kind of being a Mankind bear because I don't think that Afrezza is going to do well commercially.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the launch of the product to date has been lackluster. So I don't see any reason that to sort of be any more optimistic at this point.
Okay. One last one coming out of the chat right
Sure.
now is Inovio. It's ticker INO.
Yeah.
What's your long and short-term outlook for this stock?
Another one that I'm not a crazy fan of, and mainly because they've been around for a long time. I don't think that they've ever really sort of shown anything that is very promising. I think that they're a very promotional company, and so it's not. I guess I'm bearish on INO.
Okay, Adam, I want to go in a little bit of different direction here. I mean, obviously,
Okay, Joel, go ahead.
All right, the number one problem in American health, is obesity. And that's caused a lot of, money for our government to be spent on. There's a lot of things going on to Weight Watchers. Obviously, that stock has been crushed. And now, there's different things out there. There's different drugs. Obviously, exercising and eating better are the two best cures. But just interesting to get your take on, stocks in that sector. I mean, the Apple Watch, I mean, boy, that stock, I know we're talking biotech here, but, what if Apple, what if there's some kind of perceived health advantages to it? We're going to be the leader in the obesity sector.
Again, obesity is it's a really difficult area because there's no magic bullet, right? I mean, everyone wants there to be some drug that you can pop in your mouth and lose weight, and that we just haven't seen that, right? The weight loss drugs that are out there right now, Arena sells one, and Orexogen, and Vivus. While they have some benefit for people, they're not the panacea, right? You can't just expect to pop a pill and then shed the belly fat. So
exactly.
Like you said, diet and exercise, and that's really still the best antidote. As for Apple, I don't know. Maybe people will wear the Apple Watch and be motivated to use the exercise tracker on there, and they'll get more active, and they'll lose weight. Maybe that, I don't know if that's going to happen or not, but, again, look, I think we all, I don't know about you, Joel. I mean, I know that I just came through a really horrible Boston winter and packed on about another 10 pounds because I couldn't get out of my house. So what do I got to do? I got to eat better, and I got to start running and biking and doing all the things to start losing that weight. That's what's going to work for me. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably the best prescription.
And I think people, you're right. I think they want to take that magic pill and just have it just magically disappear when it's really diet and exercise is important. With these biotech companies, a lot of it is obviously dependent on the drug trials. You got to say that Obamacare and the general environment has been, very favorable to these stocks and these sectors. We have a presidential election coming up in a couple of years. Is there anything in the regulatory environment coming up that you think, there's been talk about, how expensive some of these drugs are and not being covered by Obamacare?
Right.
Is there anything out there on your radar that investors in this sector, should
Well,
keep an
yeah.
eye on?
I mean, I think there's, you talk about two big trends. I mean, from a regulatory standpoint, I think that the trend and when I say regulatory, I'm talking about the FDA, right? The FDA is the chief regulatory body in the United States that approves drugs, and in Europe there's an equivalent to the FDA. I think both in Europe and here in the United States, and those are the big commercial markets that everybody wants to target. I think that the trend has been really kind of lenient. I mean, I'm the FDA seems to be bending over backwards to approve drugs. They're reviewing drugs and approving them in record time. They're approving more drugs than they've ever approved before. Now you kind of wonder why. Is that because there's some sort of political message to sort of say, hey, we need to approve these drugs? Maybe part of that's what it is. But it's also the fact that a lot of the drugs that, quite frankly, a lot of drugs that are being submitted to the FDA are just better. The science is improving. People are figuring stuff out. So when the FDA gets a drug package from a company, there are not a lot of questions. It's a clear, looks that these drugs work, and so the FDA approves them. So that's a trend that you're seeing. It doesn't mean that that trend can't reverse, because we can go back and forth and see times where regulators appear to be more strict, more conservative in terms of their outlook, in terms of their reviews of drugs. But right now, it's very lenient. So I think that's one of the reasons why the sector is perform well. In terms of Obamacare and stuff, not Obamacare, but in terms of drug pricing, and you mentioned drug pricing, that has become a really big issue. That you've seen, especially with the hepatitis C drugs, you've seen a lot of pushback from insurance companies about the pricing of drugs, high pricing of cancer drugs, and that's going to be that's an issue, and that's potentially an overhang on the sector, because if insurance companies, crack down even further, if the pharmacy benefit managers crack down even further, try to restrict the way that these drugs are used, protest against high prices, that's something that people need to sort of look out for as a potential risk, in the drug biotech sector.
And just looking into your crystal ball for the next president of the actual election, I mean, if somehow the Republicans slip in there, I mean, could you see Obamacare repealed?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that's always the risk. Look, one of the if you kind of look at it from a business standpoint, just sort of step back and be sort of more simplistic. Right, more people being insured is
good. Right.
It's a good thing, right, for drug companies. If you're insured, you go to the doctor. If you're sick, you get prescribed drugs. That's more prescriptions for drug companies, so generally it's been good. Now, I don't necessarily think that, if they repeal Obamacare, they have to replace it with something. So, it remains to be seen to sort of how that would affect, drug and biotech companies. So, it's a little bit unclear there, but, generally speaking, it's been a good trend, right, for the biotech and drug companies to date.
Adam, we do have one more question coming in from Twitter, actually. Someone on Twitter wants to get your long and short-term outlook for Gilead. I mean, this is just probably the superstar of the biotech sector, I think you could say.
Right. I like Gilead. I mean, I've been a big Gilead fan for a long time. It's rare to see, the Gilead, the sort of the historical story of Gilead is, they were dominant in HIV. Their HIV drug franchise has long been dominant, and it's fueled tremendous growth in the company. And then in the last few years, they came in with hepatitis C, and then they've sort of become the dominant hepatitis C company. And so it's rare for a company to sort of to really kind of dominate two different fields like that. They're moving into cancer now, so it'll be really interesting to kind of see. They're moving into cancer, and they're also moving into other forms of liver disease strongly. So it'll be, sort of looking ahead. It'll be interesting to see what they do in those two areas. They have one of the best management teams in all of biotech. The stock can be very volatile. I mean, you can look at the chart and you can say, oh my God, it's, people, get crazy. It's going down. It's going up. I sort of tend to look at things a little bit more longer term. And I just think it's one of the best, it's one of the most well-managed biotech companies, in the sector, and something that long term, I think it's a great company.
Okay, you ready for the $64,000 question?
Uh-oh.
Okay.
Wait, let me drink some coffee first. Okay, go ahead.
What about the biotechs overall? Has the biotech bubble finally burst?
Wait, we're still debating whether a biotech bubble exists or not. So now you want to know if it burst.
Oh, great answer.
I think if you look at any charts, I don't think it. If you believe that there's a biotech bubble, it has not burst yet. So I think we're still trying to figure out whether there is one. And like I said before, I think it's a little bit simplistic to sort of say, yes, there's a bubble, or no, there's not a bubble. I think that if you can look at, in biotech, you really have to understand the stocks that you own. It's really important to kind of make sure that you know what you own, you know what the companies are developing, you know what their competitors are developing, you sort of know the timeline of things, because a stock can be very volatile depending on sort of, where in the sort of development cycle the company is, because a lot of these stocks sort of trade around drug approvals, they trade around conferences, they trade around clinical trial results. So you sort of have to really understand these stocks and look at them that way, and not just say, oh, it's biotech. I'm going to buy all these different. I'm just going to buy a bunch of stocks because it's biotech, and all biotech stocks are up. I mean, that may be true in the short term, but in the long term, a lot of these companies that are more speculative, more risky, they do blow up, and you got to be careful of that. We're seeing that this morning with Athersys. Like I said, that stock is blowing up today.
And I think
so
that's great.
That's kind of how I look at things. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's great, because it's kind of like what we talk about here on the pre-market show, is like doing your investing, doing your homework, knowing what you're being invested in. Be prepared for the best. Be prepared for the worst, and that's your approach. Adam, I can't tell you how much we appreciate you coming on the show, and you got to promise you're coming on again soon.
I will absolutely come on again, and I appreciate you guys having me on. It's fun, and like I said, I enjoy taking questions from readers and answering questions when I can. So again, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Adam. We'll definitely bring you back on again soon.
All right, Brianna, Joel, good talking to you, and have a nice weekend.
Thanks. You do the same.